Sometimes people will ask if you have a high or a low view of Scripture, and I'm generally going to answer that and say I have a low view. And the reason why I'm going to answer it that way is when they say high view of Scripture, they mean, of course, by their definition. A high view of Scripture is that all of the authors speak with one voice. That's the voice of God. And so each author has to be understood through what the other authors say. We don't take something an author says that seems to contradict something another author says and say, well, they had a disagreement here. Instead, we view it all as if it comes from one voice. And so therefore, it has to be reinterpreted through the lens of the other person. The problem with that is which one do I view as the primary lens and which one gets reinterpreted? I'm Steve Perry. This is Biblical Anarchy, and this is why I do not believe in univocality on a what would typically be called a high view of Scripture, although I'm going to argue that I have a higher view of Scripture than the people who claim to have a high view of Scripture. Here's why. Let me play this clip. This is from the movie The Case for Christ. It's the story of Lee Strobel, who was allegedly an atheist. I'm formerly an atheist. I don't believe that Lee Strobel was really, let's say, an active atheist, a person who actively did not believe in God, because some of the things he falls for, if this movie is accurate at all, which I have to presume it is, since it's called The Case for Christ, he's presenting that case. And some of the things he falls for in here are just terrible logic. Anything that a person who truly is looking through a skeptical lens would pick up on. I'm going to focus on one example because it really helps me make my argument here today. And this is here's the clip from
Swoon
the movie.
theorists tend to skim over the fact that Jesus was flogged prior to his crucifixion. Do you know what happens in a Roman flogging?
Yeah, the person is lashed with a whip.
No, not lashed. Scourged and pummeled savagely. You see, the galleyed whip is braided with metal balls and bone fragments. The flesh on Jesus' back would have been shredded. The very muscles and sinews themselves laid open to exposure. The flogging itself would have left Jesus in critical condition from massive blood loss, which is why he collapsed under the weight of the cross that the Romans made him carry through town.
Now, as you can see, he's making the argument here that the swoon theory is invalid, and I don't believe in the swoon theory myself. But the argument that he's making is that Jesus was flogged, and in this flogging, he would have lost a lot of blood, and we know that he was severely injured because he collapsed while carrying the cross. Which, if you've ever watched The Passion of the Christ, you know that's what happened. Or is it? Let's take a look. Now we get two different versions, really. When we go to the Gospels of who carried the cross. If we go to Luke, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have the same version, Simon the Cyrene, who carries the cross. If we read here in Luke 23, verse 26, and as they led him away, now pay attention to the wording here. As they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. So this contradicts the notion that Jesus started out carrying the cross, collapsed under the weight, and Simon had to start carrying it. This right here flat out says that as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene. So Simon of Cyrene is carrying the cross from the beginning. Now, if we come over here to John chapter 19, starting in verse 16 and into verse 17, it says, so they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, bearing his own cross to the place of a skull. So Jesus is carrying the cross at the end. He bore his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him. So according to John, Jesus buries his cross. So they took Jesus and he went out bearing his own cross from the beginning to the end. Carries the cross from the beginning all the way to the end. No Simon of Cyrene. But in Luke, we have Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross. Why these two different versions of the story? And more importantly for the movie, The Case for Christ, how would an atheist not pick up on this? an atheist skeptic, right? Like, again, I don't agree with the swoon theory. I'm not arguing for the swoon theory here. I think Jesus was crucified and he died. But if you're a person who is arguing for the swoon theory, which Lee Strobel claims to be in the movie, why would you not point out that this doesn't make sense, right? Jesus doesn't collapse under the weight of his own cross. See, the doctor's saying, you can't go with the swoon theory because he'd already been flogged. He collapsed under the weight of the cross. He was about to pass out. He was on the verge. Well, that's not true, right? From a biblical, if I take John and I hold it in high esteem and I say, John is telling me the truth, then I know that Jesus carried his cross from point A to point B, all the way to the end. However, if I have a high view of Scripture, then I say, well, Luke can't be lying. There has to be some historical fact in there. Univocality, right? They're speaking with one voice on what happened, and they're just giving us historical information. These are the facts. Simon of Cyrene carried the cross and Jesus carried the cross. So then, in my eyes, what makes sense? Well, it makes sense. Jesus has just indeed been flogged, according to all versions of the story. It makes sense that he would collapse under the weight of his own cross, be unable to carry it any further, and therefore Simon of Cyrene would have to carry it the rest of the way. That would make sense. It's just not true according to John. Now, if we go back to Luke, it could be true that Simon started out carrying the cross and Jesus carried it from there. There's no biblical version of this. Now, again, it's in the Passion of the Christ. It's in the Case for Christ. It's in all these movies about Jesus. It's just not true. According to these accounts, it's not true. Now, it could be historically true. I don't know. But according to these accounts, it's not true. So why is it taught as if it is true? And this is what people will call the high view of Scripture. I argue it's not. I argue it's a low view of Scripture because this version of the story, I don't know who came up with it. Again, it's a logical thing to come up with, but I don't know who came up with it, but it's their version of the story. It's not the Bible's version of the story. What is the Bible's version? Well, clearly it's contradictory, so we have to come up with some other version unless you hold the Bible in high esteem. Now, I would argue here that probably historically what happened is Simon of Cyrene carried the cross. And what John is doing here is he's making a theological point. Just like in Abraham with the binding of Isaac or the sacrifice of Isaac, where Isaac carries the wood up the mountain for his own sacrifice. Here Jesus bears on his back the wood for his own sacrifice. John's making a theological point. It's not historically true, but he's making a theological point in my belief, and I believe that this indeed is actually a high view of Scripture. But if you ask me, do you have a high view of Scripture? I'm going to say no, because I know what you mean by that. I don't believe it's all breathed out by God because I think God would know which one of these versions of the events is factually accurate, and he would give us the factually accurate event or version of events, and that's just not what happens here when you read the two together. Now, if you disagree with me, you can always leave a comment down below. If you agree with me, you can leave a comment too. I just like to point out, if you disagree and you have an interpretation that I might be interested in, that might shed some light on the matter, leave it down below. If you enjoy the video, give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, subscribe to the channel, whatever you do. Don't just sit there, do something.